everybody. I'm Lauren Wen. I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for National Health Program, the New York Metro chapter. And I have the honor of introducing to you Professor Frances Fox Piven.
Okay.
So it may appear that I have been a stalker of Professor Fox Piven for a few years, but it's really just not true. It's simply a coincidence. So we live in the same neighborhood in Manhattan. And for the last few years, since I moved to that neighborhood, Upper West Side of Manhattan, I have a tendency of running into her on the Uptown 1 train in the evenings. And the first time that happened, I was just like a little giddy schoolgirl, and I went up to her, and of course I had dutifully been going to many lectures over the last many years in New York, and I've seen her from afar, and heard her and read her words many times, but I had never been just a few feet away in the subway with her. So I went up to her and I said, "Professor Fox Piven, I'm a big fan of your work. Thank you so much for what you've done for this country." She very nicely smiled, "Thank you, thank you." So that was it. So the second time I ran into her and said, "Hello, Professor Fox Piven. I'm a fan of your work. Thank you so much for what you've done for this country." She said, "Yes, yes, thank you, thank you." The third time I ran into her, I was with none other than Katie Robbins. And we went up to her and we said, "Hello, Professor Fox Piven. We are both big fans of your work, and thank you for what you've done for this country." And I have to say that after the third time, I just stopped. I just pretended I didn't see you, because I imagined being you. So imagine you're Frances Fox Piven, and you've been an icon in the American progressive movement for several decades. And in between fighting off people like Glenn Beck and others who just decided to put on some pretty, nasty, serious campaigns to malign you and discredit you. In addition to fighting off people like that, probably on a daily basis, she fights off admirers like me, and I just figured it probably is getting annoying, so I stopped harassing you when I run into you in the subway.
That's really true.
Oh, yeah.
I can restart it. But the reason that she has legions of fans, such as myself, and probably many of you in the audience, is because since the 60s, she has been fighting on behalf of the poor and the disenfranchised in this country. She has been an expert in the development of the welfare state, political movements, urban politics, voting, and electoral politics. And she has been on the faculty of the City University of New York since 1982. Among her many books are the best-selling Poor People's Movements, Why Americans Don't Vote, Why Americans Still Don't Vote, and why Politicians Want It That Way, Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America, and The Lean Years. One of her recent books is called Who's Afraid of Frances Fox Piven? The essential writings of the professor Glenn Beck loves to hate. So she has also received numerous academic and public awards for her work. She was the president of the American Sociological Association in 2007. She has served on the boards of the American Civil Liberties Union and the Democratic Socialists of America, and was a founding board chair of the New Press, and is currently a Left Forum board member. The last thing I want to say is that I think you are also inadvertently responsible for the first paid political job that I ever had. I had been an AIDS activist, but I knew nothing about electoral politics, and at some point I got really obsessed with electoral politics and said, I need to learn about this, and I'm going to find myself a job doing this. And the first thing I did was to read Why Americans Still Don't Vote and the Poor People's Movement. So I think that's why Acorn and Projectville hired me, just on that fact alone. Anyway, so perhaps for the last time, perhaps not, I'm going to say in front of all these people, Professor Fox Piven, I'm a really big fan of your work, and thank you for everything you've done for this country.
I'm really glad to be here and for this chance to talk with you. I think your organization is wonderful, and I think we're basically all on the same side. What's more, I think we're on the same side of most Americans, although it's hard to see that. Because we have been through a kind of big and tumultuous change in American politics that I want to talk about today. But to give you some sense of how big that change is and who is responsible for it, I'll begin with a kind of little vignette that has to do with Dwight Eisenhower. I can remember when Eisenhower was president, and a few of you may be able to remember that as well. But you know, in the early 1950s, Eisenhower penned a letter to his brother, I think it was Milton, and he said in the letter that these Hunt brothers, do you know who the Hunts were?
Yeah.
They were silver magnates. They had made their fortunes through the hard work of owning silver mines. And Eisenhower said, these people, they think they're going to get rid of Social Security. They're living in a dream land. Social Security is here today, is here to stay. And, you know, nothing remarkable about that letter. Everybody probably agreed with it. On the right, the broad Republican right, and on the left. In fact, on the broad left in the United States, in the early 1950s, there was a lot of political confidence that the United States was joining the family of European welfare states, that we had begun with the 1935 Social Security Act, the creation of social insurance for the old and the disabled, and for categorical assistance for the very poor. That was one reason for confidence. Another reason for confidence was that we now had a labor law that protected workers who wanted to unionize, and partly as a consequence of that law itself, won through tumultuous labor struggles, but as a consequence of that law, labor unions were growing. The industrial workers of America, who only a decade or 2 decades before had been treated by the media as scum, were now unionized workers, big-chested, big-muscled fellows who were on their way to becoming the so-called middle class. The Depression and the war had together led to a kind of convulsion in the organization of America's 2 political parties, so that we now had a Democratic Party. We didn't have this before the 1930s, a Democratic Party that included the mass of urban working people. And there was no question in the minds of most people on the left that we would move forward to tame big business, to rein in its predatory tendencies, and that we had also, after all, achieved a kind of reversal in the tendencies of the Supreme Court in the 1930s. The Supreme Court reversed itself and declared the bulk of New Deal legislation to be constitutional. We were on the road to developing a politics and a government which would give Americans economic security, maybe world peace, and of course, national health care. Well, if I was Rip Van Winkle, and I had gone to sleep at that point in American history, the early 1950s, and woken up today, I would be very befuddled. Our political world here in the United States, not even to speak about the Eurozone, seems to have gone totally crazy. What has happened? The government, the national government, is in a shutdown. Is that a symptom of our craziness? But it's also going to be a cause of madness. It's a kamikaze tactic which threatens not only the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of federal workers, which not only is shutting down programs much needed by the poorest people in America. That's what's important, not the national monuments, but it's a kamikaze tactic. Who did it? You know, I read the New York Times online, but I get the Wall Street Journal delivered. So in the headlines of my daily newspaper, Obama shut down the federal government. No question. But in fact, the House Republicans shut down the federal government, and they did it with a kind of cloud of wild propaganda. Amazing propaganda. Think of the way the right wing, the organized right wing, in the House of Representatives and outside the House of Representatives, characterizes now the President of the United States. Now, I don't want to show too much respect for the President of the United States, but it has been our custom to speak, back in the 1950s, to speak about the President of the United States, not in reverential tones, but with a sort of restraint and respect. Not Obama. Obama is a Muslim. Obama is a socialist. Obama is a fascist. Some of the portraits give him a Hitler-like mustache. Obama is a liar, 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 liar. They're screaming mad. Not only the mob right-wing populists, but leading businessmen in the United States. Now, leading businessmen usually seem to be thoughtful, forward-looking, because they have so much at stake, right? They want to save what's theirs and increase it. Well, listen to them today. I told you I read the Wall Street Journal. A guy named Ben Mosky from AIG, remember AIG that was bailed out at the beginning of the financial crisis, is publicly comparing the effort to rein in the bonuses of business executives, comparing that to lynchings in America. Or Stephen Schwartzman, who's the chair of a leading equity capital group, the Blackstone Group, compares the effort to close the extraordinary tax loopholes that businessmen get as a consequence of reporting their income as capital gains. The effort to close that tax loophole, he compares to Hitler invading Poland. Do you think there's madness in the country? There is. And it's not only at the bottom, it's also at the top. We have to explain that. I don't think they're lying exactly, but what's driving them crazy? Meanwhile, of course, the little mobs of Tea Partiers scream things like, remember the classic scream, "Don't let government get its hands on my Medicare"?
Yes, correct.
They listen to Fox News because they think that that's where they get both sides of the story. And you know what they scream at their rallies? I have been to Tea Party rallies. I wear big sunglasses. And I go with friends. They scream again and again, "Take it back, take it back, take it back." Take what are they worrying about? I think there's an answer to that question. I think that we can understand the extraordinary conflicts, the instability, the excitement that's overtaking the country today. And there are comparable periods in our past. I wrote an email to a colleague of mine, an Oxford professor who studies American politics. It's best to have a little distance. And I said, "It's like the 1850s, isn't it?" He said, "Absolutely." I haven't heard that from any of my colleagues around me in my school. What happened in the 1840s and 50s? The big political parties split apart. The Whigs fractured. The Democrats also, although not as dramatically as the Whigs, and they fractured under the impact of a movement, or really two movements. One movement was the movement of abolitionists. Now, the abolitionists were church people. They were based in the American Protestant churches. And they were, I suppose you could say, they were a little fanatical because they had only one issue. And
We don't know what that's like here.
Oh, okay, good. And that issue was emancipation. And emancipation immediately, that was their issue. And they pursued that issue with oratory in their churches, on the street corners, in their little presses, and they drove the slaveholding South absolutely nuts. So there was a kind of counter movement in the South that led to the Confederacy and recruitment for the Confederate Army and the fugitive slave law. The country was torn apart by these movements, and that the movements in turn tore apart the Protestant churches. The country, we were always a divided country. The slaveholding South was different than the wage-based North. But compromise had kept us together, the Missouri Compromise, for example. And that compromise was affected by the political parties, which were intersectional parties. But it was based at the ground level on churches that were also intersectional, on a culture that tried to be intersectional. The abolitionists drove a red-hot wedge into those compromises. And as it did, the parties split apart in 1860. Abe Lincoln was nominated by one of the new splinter parties, a third party, Republican Party. And the Southern elites were so enraged and upset that the secession, the Southern secession from the Union began, paving the way for the Civil War. A terrible thing, the bloodiest war in American history. But in its aftermath, we did get what was called at the time the new birth of freedom, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Well, I hope it doesn't come to that. I really do. A new birth of freedom would be a good thing. The price paid for that in this country, mainly, of course, by ordinary people, was horrific. So we got to try to understand what's going on today and how to make use of it for our political agenda, which is also, I am absolutely convinced, the political agenda of the mass of people in the United States. I think today we're not fighting over slavery. Well, in a certain way we are. The residues of that conflict are very strong. But I think today there are two main sources of conflict, turbulence, of the deep fissures, the anger, the craziness in our country. The first source of conflict is very ancient. Very ancient. It's the conflict between concentrated property or wealth and democracy. You know, since the 17th century at least, the idea of democracy has been, I think, the most invigorating and stimulating idea in the world, because it was the idea that ordinary people would control government, would control the state with its armed forces, its great coercive capacity, and also its legal majesty. What an idea that you and I, that we all together will control what they, the rulers, who can call out armies, who can throw debtors in jail, we will control what they do. Well, that idea, which still today stirs the passion of people, of ordinary people, that idea was also very, very threatening to those who had, to elites who controlled property, who were the beneficiaries of traditions of aristocracy, who controlled the levers of the economy. It was a very, very threatening, and each time, each new, renewed democratic struggle spurred stiff resistance from those on top. The democratic idea has also always been resisted, and resisted with fury. In the United States, that resistance has led to crippling limits on democratic rights, at the same time as the struggles for democratic rights have led to the, in a sense, official and legal expansion of democratic rights. Have you ever wondered why we, as the world's first democracy, and of course the best democracy, why we enfranchise virtually everyone in the country, and yet we have turnout levels in our biggest elections of only 50 or 60%? And that's because parallel to the formal expansion of democratic rights, to the new birth of freedom, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, to the granting of the franchise to women, to the civil rights struggle, which made the 19th century struggle for voting rights for blacks, which actually realized the victories of that struggle. Because parallel to that expansion, in principle, of the right to vote, have been the multiple ways in which the right has been taken away in practice. Partly with at the very beginning with property laws, religious laws, poll taxes. And then when those were overcome, we introduced bureaucratic and procedural barriers like voter registration, a voter registration system, which is unique in the world for the procedural hoops that it introduces. It creates really a two-step process in voting, and the first step is the hardest, and if you overcome that, then you have to wait on very long lines in certain neighborhoods. Moreover, what democratic country doesn't have a holiday on election day? This is especially when two parents work and the kids have to have, and you understand. And if the crippling limits on the vote were not sufficient, we also have crippling limits on representation. Now, we're a big, complicated country. We don't have direct democracy. All of us could make decisions in this room, but a country of over 300 million cannot make decisions. We have to have a representative democracy, and this has been true from the beginning. But it's also the case that from the beginning, in the written into the American Constitution, are sharp limits on the representation of certain voters. So yeah, you get to go out and vote if you live in California, but your vote counts 1/10 of the vote of somebody in Alaska in the Senate of the United States, and that disproportion is reflected in the Electoral College, which produces the presidency. And then parts of our government aren't exposed to voters at all. After all, for votes to matter, you have to have not only periodic elections, as well as the ability of voters to organize, to speak, to assemble, but you also, those who make decisions have to be exposed to the voters' decisions, right? Well, the federal courts are not. The Supreme Court of the United States is not. And throughout the 19th and early 20th century, the federal court, regularly struck down the victories of labor in the legislatures of the state and even the Congress of the United States. And it is doing it today. It's doing it today. Of course it's doing it today. That's what Citizens United is doing, and now they're trying for a court decision that will eliminate any limits on individual giving of money to PACs, for example. And that isn't even to speak of what I think is the great problem of any contemporary democracy, and that has to do with government secrecy. It really is. It's such a big problem that, you know, we say something about it and then we don't think about it. And I don't mean just the NSA. I mean that it's so difficult to understand what a contemporary government does. Why is it the case that Fox News can spread these lies about the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare? Because who can understand it? I mean, everybody's working hard. And anyway, legislation is hard to read. It's boring, it's technical. Yet in order to fully understand it, you have to understand the laws that are being replaced. It's extremely complicated. In the great era of radical democracy, which led to the American Revolution, the radical Democrats, whose guru was, of course, Tom Paine, absolutely believed that they should have a legislature close enough a decision-making body close enough so that they could go there and watch from the balcony what the legislators did, listened, and then every year get to vote them out. We can't do that. And that, the imperviousness of government, partly deliberate because it's secret, or hidden in the maws of the bureaucracy, and partly maybe inevitable because governance is so complicated in the contemporary era, it opens the door for the extraordinary flood of propaganda that has accompanied, for example, and it's just an example because it's always there, that has accompanied the Obama administration's very timid initiatives, including Obamacare itself. Well, this is the way, the conflict between wealth and property on the one hand, the concentrated inequality of the world outside of democratic spheres, the conflict between that and the ideal of democracy. It's an ideal of equality. Everybody gets the vote unless you committed a crime. And I don't want to get into felon disenfranchisement now, but that's a problem too. There's a conflict between inequality outside democratic spheres and the at least potential equality that can be created by a democratic realization. So that conflict is very intense today. Very intense. Why is it so intense? Well, because inequality is becoming so extreme. And, you know, the rich get scared.
Right.
You don't think they're ever, you tend not to think they're scared. After all, they can hire their own bodyguards and things like that. They get scared. We're going to take away their extraordinary privileges that mainly have to do with making money. And today, they're scared partly because they've gotten so rich, but they're also scared because we live in the wake of a series of democratic victories. The Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act. I mean, it's true the Supreme Court went after the Voting Rights Act. Why?
Because it worked.
Because it worked. The National Voter Registration Act. In 2008, we had an election with the highest turnout since the 19th century, and particularly of the groups that we are usually disenfranchised by American electoral procedures. Poor people, minorities, and youth. Well, that high turnout election gave us Barack Obama. It was a victory. I know. But it was a victory. And then we had another election. If you don't believe that this is still a fight, it's not the 17th century, it's the 21st century, it's still a fight between property and democracy. Look at what happened in the aftermath of that election. 2010 was a low turnout election. It's to be expected. Turnout is low in off-year elections. Some of that low turnout is, in a way, deliberately planned. But let's just say it's characteristically a low turnout election, a midterm election. And in that low turnout election, the large numbers of poor people, minorities, and youth, their turnout dropped even more because they're not habitual voters. Low turnout gave us Republican legislatures in a bunch of states. Those legislatures proceeded to gerrymander congressional districts wantonly. I mean, they had no shame. And to give us what we now call the Tea Party Congress. Now, the Tea Party Congress, re-elected in 2012, when the Republican congressional vote was actually 1.5 million voters less than the Democratic congressional vote for the House. Talk about gerrymandering. That Tea Party Congress then proceeded with the tutoring and coordination of the American Legislative Exchange Council, an organization dedicated to controlling state legislatures whose members are corporate executives who pay dues and state legislators who get in for free. They proceeded with a full-scale attack on voting rights. Can you imagine? Who would have thought, at this point in our history, new voter ID, photo ID laws, laws that limited early voting. You know, Florida, for example, eliminated voting on the Sunday before Election Day because that's when most blacks had come to vote. Laws that limited volunteer groups who did voter registration, like, you know, League of Women Voters. Laws that limited what they could do, made it so bureaucratically complicated for them to get authorized to do voter registration, and suscepted them to legal penalties if they didn't observe all the complexity. So they stopped doing voter registration. Now, don't dismiss the fear, the paranoia, the craziness that is at work here. It's true that business is divided, that finance, for example, I remember asking a lefty economist many, many years ago, where's the brains of capitalism? Where do you think it is? And he said, in finance. Well, finance is a little worried about this kind of politics. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, Citigroup, they're very worried that this standoff in Washington, the shutting down of the government, could actually lead to a default on American debt. But you know, other powerful businessmen are funding the crazies, the Koch brothers, for example, and they get support because a lot of businessmen are scared. And think of that, they're scared of democracy, not scared of socialism. They say that, but they're scared of democracy. Well, there's another source of fissure, instability, conflict in American politics today, and that has to do with demographic and cultural changes, ongoing demographic and cultural changes that are occurring. The American electorate, and remember, I just made a case that they actually are scared of the electorate. Well, the American electorate is changing very rapidly. We are going to have, or a lot of places we already have, an electoral majority made up of minorities. And these minorities, together with young people, you know, young people are a blessing. Who knows why? I think it's youth culture. I think it's the music. I don't know what it is. But while these sort of old people, and I have to be respectful of the old because I'm old, but they're sort of old. They come together and they chant and they scream, "Take it back," at their rallies. And they scream that because they are, in fact, afraid of losing it. And that's because in significant ways they are losing it. They're on the defensive. And they're ready to respond to the Koch brothers and the political organizations that they've created. They're available as the cadre, these upper middle class, almost retirees or already retirees, white. They're available as the cadres of what someone has called a rich people's movement. Because they don't like change, because change devalues their culture. It does. They're scared of all the sex stuff. It frightens them. It gives them, their bellies tremble. And they're scared of dark-skinned people. So, and not only that, they are not the only movement that is emerging in the United States today, or that has emerged and is growing in the United States today. Yes, there is a rich people's movement. It's the Tea Partiers and the evangelical allies. In a certain sense, they're always there. But we have other movements that are, in a way, budding. Occupy was a signal. And the enormous traction and excitement created by a slogan. We are the 99%, they are the 1%, is a signal of a potential that arises out of the vast increase in inequality and also the increase in insecurity for young, many of them college-educated people, and the incredible increase in indebtedness because the rise of the financial industry has meant that the savings of ordinary people are being clawed back by finance. So we're at a very uncertain political moment. We see the interplay of movements, of electoral change, powerful interest groups. We are uncertain about what's going to happen. We don't know, I don't know, you don't know. But it is true that in similar moments in the past, similar moments of instability and uncertainty, progressive change sometimes became possible. I already mentioned the 1840s and 50s when the breakup of the parties, particularly of the Whigs, the rise of third parties, civil war, did give us a new birth of freedom. In the 1930s, the early years of the Depression were also very unstable. Widespread panic over the economic shutdown. But that in turn led to a new but unstable democratic coalition. A coalition between the South, okay, it'll be less than 5 minutes. Between the South, oh my God.
You can go over.
I know.
Yeah, please, please.
Just talk. We can miss a little lunch.
Food doesn't matter.
Yes, yes,
A coalition between the traditionally democratic South and the urban working class North. And that period of electoral change and instability was a hospitable environment for very important movements. That gave us the movement of the unemployed and the movement the workers' movement of the 1930s and the progressive legislation of the New Deal that resulted. The 1950s, 60s, that led to the rising of the Black freedom movement and its mind-boggling accomplishments. Obama as president, you know, for all of his timidity, a black man is president of the United States. But the late 50s, early 1960s was also a period of great electoral instability. The Republicans and the Democrats couldn't decide which one of them, or if either one of them, would try to win the black vote. And the Democrats took the leap, and a lot of the troubles of the Democratic Party have followed. Well, I think we're at a moment like that. It's a very unstable, unpredictable environment. There are no guarantees as to what would happen if the fledgling movements of Walmart workers, of retail workers, of poor people, of the students, of these fledgling movements which are fueled by powerful stresses and hardships, if these fledgling movements would grow. No guarantees. But then again, there are no guarantees about anything anymore. After all, the seas may rise as the weather, the climate gets hotter. We have to live in a period of uncertainty and do what we think we should do in the face of uncertainty. I think we face a long struggle to restore the progressive tradition in the United States and improve upon it. But on the other hand, I can personally testify that a struggling life is a good life. Thank you.